It was a stormy night in the small town of Hollow Creek. The kind of night when the wind howls through the trees like a living thing, and the rain beats against the windows in a relentless rhythm. The streets were deserted, as most townsfolk preferred to stay indoors, huddled in the warmth of their homes. But something strange was happening on the airwaves. At exactly 11:13 p.m., every television in town, whether on or off, flickered to life with the same chilling broadcast. It was an old black-and-white news report, the footage grainy and distorted, as if it had been pulled from the depths of a forgotten archive. The screen showed a newscaster, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, speaking in a trembling voice. "This is a public service announcement. If you are watching this, it may already be too late. Do not look away. Do not turn off your television. They are here, and they are watching." The screen crackled, and for a brief moment, a terrifying image flashed across the screen. A shadowy figure standing in a dimly lit room, its face obscured, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Then, as suddenly as it began, the broadcast ended, leaving only the eerie sound of static. Those who saw it were left with a sense of dread that they couldn't shake. But what was more unsettling was that no one could remember what had happened during the broadcast, or how long it had lasted. It was as if time itself had been distorted, but the true horror was just beginning. The next morning, the town was abuzz with talk of the mysterious broadcast. Most dismissed it as a prank, a technical glitch, or an old broadcast that had somehow been replayed by mistake. But a few, like Sarah and David, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sarah, a local reporter for the Hollow Creek Gazette, had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained. When she heard about the broadcast, she knew she had to investigate. David, her childhood friend and a skeptic by nature, agreed to help her, though he didn't believe anything sinister was afoot. They began by interviewing the residents who had witnessed the broadcast, but the stories were all the same. No one could remember the exact details, only that they had seen something that filled them with an overwhelming sense of fear. As they dug deeper, they discovered that similar broadcasts had been reported in the town before, always at 11:13 p.m., always during a storm, and always followed by something terrible. Years ago, a family had vanished without a trace the day after one of these broadcasts. In another instance, a man had gone mad, claiming that they were coming for him, only to disappear himself days later. The town's history was riddled with such incidents, but they were always hushed up, swept under the rug by the authorities. Sarah and David knew they were onto something, but they didn't realize just how dangerous their investigation would become. As they continued their research, Sarah found an old VHS tape hidden away in the town's library archives. The label read simply, "Do not watch." Ignoring the warning, Sarah and David played the tape, and what they saw left them both shaken. The footage was grainy, like the broadcast, but this time it showed a group of people in a dark room, their faces filled with terror. They were seated in a circle, chanting in a language neither Sarah nor David could understand. The camera panned to a clock on the wall, which read 11:13. As the seconds ticked down, the chanting grew louder, more frantic, until the clock struck 11:14. The screen went black, and when the image returned, the room was empty, the people gone. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What had happened to those people, and what was the significance of 11:13? They decided to dig deeper, searching for any connection between the clock, the chanting, and the disappearances. They learned of an ancient ritual, one designed to summon beings from beyond the veil of reality. The ritual had been banned centuries ago. its practice punishable by death, but some believed it was still performed in secret. As the next storm approached, Sarah and David realized with growing dread that the ritual was connected to the broadcasts, and that 11:13 p.m. was the moment when the barrier between worlds was at its weakest. That night, the storm was worse than any the town had seen in years. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the wind howled through the streets. Sarah and David, armed with the knowledge they had gathered, prepared themselves for what was to come. At 11:13 p.m., the broadcast began again. This time, Sarah and David were ready, cameras rolling, determined to document whatever happened. The screen flickered to life, showing the same newscaster from the first broadcast, but this time she was crying, her voice barely a whisper. "They're here. Don't look away. Don't let them in." The screen cut to the shadowy figure again, but now there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, standing in the darkness, their glowing eyes fixed on the camera. The clock on the screen read 11:13, the seconds ticking away. As the clock struck 11:14, the figures began to move, their forms flickering as they stepped closer to the camera. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging Sarah and David into darkness. They fumbled for their flashlights, their hearts pounding. The air around them grew colder, and they could hear whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, surrounding them. "They're coming," David whispered, his voice trembling. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as the shadowy figures from the broadcast began to materialize in the room with them. Sarah and David backed away, their flashlights flickering as the figures advanced. But just as they were about to be overwhelmed, the storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a banshee. The clock in the room struck 11:15, and with a blinding flash of lightning, the figures vanished, the whispers silenced. The power returned, and the room was still. Sarah and David were shaken but alive. They had survived, but the town of Hollow Creek had been changed forever. In the days that followed, the town was eerily quiet. The broadcast was never mentioned again, and those who had seen it refused to speak of it. But Sarah and David knew the truth. Something had been unleashed that night, something that couldn't be contained. The VHS tape they had found was gone, as if it had never existed. The only evidence of what had happened was their footage, but even that was corrupted, the images distorted, and the audio filled with static. As they left Hollow Creek, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the shadowy figures. The Vanishing Hour, as she called it, was a time when the barriers between worlds grew thin, and those who watched the broadcast became vulnerable to forces beyond their understanding. And somewhere, in the depths of the storm, the figures were waiting, watching, ready to return when the clock struck 11:13 p.m. If you have interesting stories and want to tell about them, send them to me by email. Link in description. Bye.